One might assume that mid-8th century Danes were a bunch of ragtag raiders, but they were actually subject to the Danish monarch, Horik.
For you and I are not equals.
It was not in his best interest to allow the leaders below him to venture off, finding their own glory and riches, as it could encourage their own autonomy. But this singularity of a Danish kingdom ceased to exist in 854, when his nephew, Guthrum, returned from exile and killed him during an invasion. The fracturing of this kingdom gave the Danes the freedom from authority to do as they please, and England saw in full force what freedom to these heathens looked like. We left part 1 with the death of Athelred I in 871, the year Alfred would become King of Wessex, and a second heathen army would descend upon Reading, in which the Danes would scatter the English forces, whilst Alfred attended his brother's funeral at Wimborne in Dorset. Alfred was thrust into reigning during what could be considered the most turbulent time in history for the West Saxon kingdom. Within a month of being named king, he was defeated by the Danes at Wilton, west of Salisbury, which was described by Asser as being a hill. The Englishmen fighting the Danes at Wilton assumed victory at this battle, when the Vikings suddenly turned tail and fled. A small number of pursuers chased them, and the Vikings re-engaged and went on to be masters of the battlefield on this day. The reason for fleeing is unknown, but there is a theory that this was a calculated battle plan. Unfortunately, we can't know for certain at this time. Within the last year, the English had engaged in 9 known battles with Viking forces, accompanied by innumerable skirmishes. But in 871, the West Saxons bought peace on the condition that the Vikings leave, which they did. By autumn of 871, Viking leader named Halfdan, son of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok, took his army to London to settle for the winter. Evidence of coins being made bearing the image of Halfdan indicate that there was a Viking settlement there during the following years, but for the main army, it was merely another winter break. Now, in 872, the Northumbrians revolted against their puppet king, the English nobleman Egbert, who was installed by the Vikings in 867. Egbert fled Northumbria, and the Vikings in London seemed set on reacting to this as they begin to travel north. However, the heathen army take refuge in Trent at Torksey in the Mercian province of Lindsey, and seem to decide that taking back Northumbria was not worth the while. Perhaps the prospect of travelling north to an already fractured, already plundered region was not in their best interest, so they remained for the year at Torksey. The Mercians bought peace for themselves and for their province of Lindsey from the Vikings who were dwelling on their lands, but the Vikings marched on Repton, in the heart of the Mercian kingdom. Their king, Burgred of Mercia, appears to not have been willing to fight the Vikings, and he fled to Rome and lived out the remainder of his life there until his death in 888. In response, the Vikings installed a puppet leader once again, by the name of Cerwulf. It may be pronounced Cherwulf, but palatalization becomes less common the farther north that you go, so I will refer to him as Cerwulf for now. Through the power of the oath, and holding hostages, the Vikings encouraged him to swear to hand over the kingdom to them should they ever wish to occupy it. This condition was met 3 years later in 877, but we'll discuss more of that later. Things were not looking good for Alfred. The beginning years of his new reign saw Vikings ravaging England, and his powerful Mercian neighbours were now at the whim of his greatest enemy. 874 saw an interesting occurrence in the heathen ranks. As from Mercia, the army split in two, despite being a singular unit since 865. leaders Guthrum, Oschitel and Anod took their armies south to Cambridge, whilst Halfdan ventured north. In 876, after taking his army to the mouth of the River Tyne, Halfdan set his sights on the Picts and the Britons of the northern reaches of Britain, seemingly to no avail, because these people didn't have much to be taken from them in the first place. He returned to Northumbria to carry out the first of 3 great partitions of territory, whereby he splits up the conquered Anglo-Saxon estates around York between his veterans, and the Vikings begin to settle, becoming farmers rather than raiders. This marks the birth of the Danelaw. The Vikings were here to stay. The Danish armies stretched across the land, now encompassed over a third of eastern England. Guthrum's men, however, and his fellow leaders, were attacking Wessex during this time. In late 875, they moved from Cambridge to Wareham, destroying all in their path. But since the army was now much smaller after the split, the West Saxons were able to discuss terms of peace, as they were now on fairly equal footing. In response, Guthrum's men took the money in exchange for peace and releasing of the hostages. They swore by their holy armlets to leave the lands of the West Saxons. And they all lived happily ever after. No, of course not. Guthrum immediately broke the peace treaty by attacking the Roman fortress of Exeter. Alfred was quickly on his tail, but they had already secured themselves there before Alfred's arrival. Guthrum was expecting reinforcements to come and bail them out of being walled into a fortress, while King Alfred and his men lay in wait. And those reinforcements came. The seafaring Danes were approaching the shores off Swanage, but the prayers of the Christians and the fears of the pagans thundered down as a terrible storm wiped out the fleet, leaving Guthrum and his men stranded. The Vikings saw no other option than to negotiate. They swore peace and handed over every hostage which Alfred demanded. You may be wondering, how long's this peace going to last? If there's one thing you should take away from this documentary, it's that you should always be wary when striking deals with 9th century Vikings. Guthrum's men overwintered in Exeter, and in 877 they moved to Gloucester, which was in Mercia, and they ordered their puppet king Cerwulf to honour their bargain from 3 years prior, meaning that the Vikings got the eastern half of Mercia, while they left Cerwulf to the west. Then, in 878, Guthrum does it again. He breaks the truce. Guthrum descends onto Chippenham in Wessex. The interesting thing about this particular attack is that it happened in mid-January, which was the middle of winter. Every Viking ruler prior had seen out the entire winter before attacking. This gave the Vikings the initiative of the battle, as it was completely unexpected. Many West Saxons submitted to Guthrum in the opening weeks of 878, whilst others escaped the country by sea. King Alfred was forced to fall back to an area west of Selwood, presumably to remain undetected by the Vikings. The English forces did win an important battle in early 878, as an army of Vikings, thought to be led by one of Halfdan's brothers, crossed to Devon from South Wales with 23 ships and 800 men, only to be killed by the King's Thanes during an attempt to besiege Countersbury Hill. However, this would not be enough to turn the tide of war. By Easter of 878, Alfred had withdrew to Athelney, known then as the Isle of Athelney, due to it being a hill surrounded by marshy wetlands. Alfred would have been in a state of pure distress, feeling as though he was the king who lost it all, from the great founding father King Cerdic to his grandfather Egbert, who conquered so much land he was called the Bretwalder. To Alfred, a man in despair, as his entire legacy has been ripped away from him by heathens. He must have assumed that the land of the West Saxons would be partitioned amongst the Viking leaders before the year was done. However, From his base in Athelney, Alfred had employed guerrilla tactics and constantly engaged in fights with Viking raiding parties, which must have stirred belief that some level of resistance was indeed possible. He was also mustering the men of Somerset, Wiltshire and Hampshire, which Alfred led to Edington in May of 878 to meet with the enemy 15 miles south of their camp in Chippenham. Guthrum's men obliged, and the Battle of Edington took place. Alfred ordered his men to form a shield wall, and after hours and hours of brutal clashing of fearsome warriors, the West Saxons broke Guthrum's line and forced them to retreat to their camp in Chippenham. The Danes held out in the camp for 2 weeks before once again agreeing to terms. But this time, the terms were different. They were forced to agree on leaving Wessex forever, but they were also forced to agree on their king, Guthrum, being baptised. 3 weeks later, Guthrum and 30 of his chiefs were entertained by Alfred for 12 days at Aller, near Athelney, for Guthrum to be baptised in front of his men.
Do you renounce the devil and all his work?
I do.
Let this water cleanse you and make you worthy of God's blessing. Guthrum, you are now a child of God.
Amen.
Amen.
It would appear as though Alfred was using this as a declaration that the Christian God is far superior to the pagan gods worshipped by the Vikings, and 30 of Guthrum's high-ranking men were there to witness their king in acceptance of that fact. Guthrum was baptised with the new name Athelstan, and Alfred was his godfather. The Danish army was still grand, despite the defeat at Edington, and they moved from Chippenham to Cirencester of Mercia in autumn of 878. The first decade of Alfred's reign has been a roller coaster of ups and downs, and though it may appear that it ended on a high, of the 4 kingdoms that existed prior to the descent of the Viking army in 865, only Alfred's Wessex remained in its entirety, whilst the 3 Danish armies spread across what we now call the Danelaw found their permanent settlement across the conquered regions of East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria.